Yes, good morning. It's really great to be with you again. It's an honor to be invited. My name is Vanessa Proudman. I'm director of SPARC Europe. And surprise, surprise, I will be talking to you about open science infrastructure. I won't be talking about SCOS, but I'll be talking about a study that we did last year, where Kwon was also one of the survey respondents, to better understand the open science infrastructure landscape in Europe. I need to say that most of the large EOSC infrastructures are not included, but it includes a lot of scholarly communication infrastructures, but I'll tell you a little bit more about that. And it was really to understand what infrastructures do we have in place, and what does it mean to be sustainable? How healthy are they? So we go forward. So this project was funded by the Open Society Foundations. And the goals of the project were to enable a durable, scalable and thriving open science infrastructure into the future. So first of all, we need to understand what infrastructures are currently in place in Europe. And we also, through our investigation, we want to push the envelope to increasingly make that infrastructure more open, following open principles. And by investigating the open science infrastructure in Europe, we want to find a better way of securing its future financial independence. So this also links to Invest in Open Infrastructure, which is an initiative run by Caitlin Thaney in the United States. We are on the steering board, and this is kind of part of the research activities that they are conducting as well. So you can see in the yellow box here, conducting research to better understand the funding and infrastructure landscape, helping assess, build and invest in open infrastructure, and piloting solutions to enact change. So it's actually a global initiative. They're developing their strategy right now. So how can we globally invest in open science infrastructure? So this feeds into IOI, and we've consulted with them along the process. So the project was led by SPARC Europe in collaboration with OPERAs, and Pierre was involved. He's talking next. And Bianca Kramer and Jeroen Bosman, I think you know as well. So it was an international survey with, we actually had about 350 responses, but we were quite strict because we really wanted to understand some of the critical international or national, regional rather than local infrastructures. We wanted to, we didn't want to focus on projects which are mainly funded through development grants. So services, infrastructure currently running, reasonably mature. And then a subset of that group answered questions on governance and sustainability. So the report came out last year. If you haven't seen it, that's the link to it. And as I said, what we wanted to find out was what is the service and infrastructure offering for open science? Who does it serve? What open principles does that infrastructure follow? What about technology? Are open standards being followed, open source, to what extent? And what does the governance structure look like? How community owned and steered is it? That was important for us going forward to find out more of there. And also, what about the financial sustainability? So you're probably asking, what do you mean by infrastructure? It's one of those words. But, you know, in the broadest sense here, you can see this is the range of infrastructures that responded. So it's from discovery systems to hosting systems, archiving and preservation services, also creation systems like Humanum, and evaluation and commenting providers, as well as publishers. What was really critical for us, so this is, I think, a really nice graphic, is to, with this study, to try to understand which are the core infrastructures that we depend upon. So this, I hope you can see it. You can see it more in the report, but here you can see that there are certain nodes of infrastructure that are really important for many. So we asked the respondents to mention by name who they depend upon. So they're often aggregation and indexing systems, search, storage, and particularly identity and persistent identifier services. So you can see here ORCID being key, Crossref, DOAJ we've already heard about this morning, but also systems like BASE or OpenAir, aggregating and indexing, and DataSite and others. So you can see, so I think this really informs us to see how important certain infrastructures are, and then it's important to know how stable they are going forward. So who's paying for the operations going forward? And many of these are rather stable, and they also depend upon membership fees. So that's a type of community funding from our libraries, for example. And that's important to take this forward because, as you see, many infrastructures are dependent on these for their services. So then we also wanted to find out about how far did or does some of this infrastructure follow open principles. So building on the work of Jeffrey Bilder and Cameron Nealon and others who set out these principles for scholarly infrastructures back in 2015, there are a number of principles that have been developed since. We wanted to test the core SPARC principles, so the good practice principles of scholarly communication services. They're not necessarily ideal in all circumstances for all services or infrastructures, but we still wanted to get some data and understanding of to what extent are some of these services implementing principles that were set in 2019. So this is very much a self-assessment. We asked those infrastructures to tell us how mature they were in embedding certain principles. So from good governance to open standards to open content and other things like succession planning, meaning what processes do you have planned in place if you were to transfer your service onwards or to wind down? So so we asked them, how mature were you? How far are you in implementing, or are you just in a planning phase? And you can see that the strengths, so again, this is only a self-assessment. So, you know, we see here that open content and open standards, you have the most maturity, and looking forward, we also ask specifically the infrastructures, how far do they comply with open standards? So we do see a very huge majority seeing that they are following open standards being so important to exchange and interchange data and for interoperability. So interoperability is so key between the many infrastructures we have. So there are many who are using open standards, but there are also quite a few who are only using open standards, and that's what we would like to promote going forward, which makes things easier, as I say, to interoperate for reasons of interoperability. We also asked about open source. To what extent do the infrastructures use open source? So many use open source, and some of them partly, and to a lesser extent, some don't. But again, going forward, we'd like to promote more open science infrastructures also using open source where they can. So just moving away, so I showed you some of the maturity graphs, but there were also quite some challenges, and where there were others who were, let me just remind you of that slide, planning, and some of the areas of perhaps weakness. We asked about what were some of the challenges with open principles and with applying those, and we saw that good governance, being community governed, getting engagement from your community, getting good representation on all sorts of levels was still quite a challenge for many. And then we saw also with open content, many services and infrastructures had challenges because they depended on content coming from outside, they had licensing issues, technical issues with APIs, etc. So there's still work to be done here. And also, open standards was an area of challenge because standards change. How do you follow that? Particularly if you're a small infrastructure, how do you, keep up to date with that? So there's still work to be done. What was also important for us is open science infrastructure. Ideally, it's really community-led. So we wanted to find out how far do you actually engage with researchers, because of course most of this is to serve researchers and libraries. And we saw that 51 out of 64 who answered this question, they indeed investigate user needs, and many within the last year or in the last 2 years. So that's good news to see that there's a good engagement, good connection with researchers in feeding the development of our infrastructures in open science. But what about the financial sustainability findings? What do we know about the financial health of this open science infrastructure? So the key expenses are salaries and benefits, no surprises there. Travel and meetings, not very relevant in the last year or this year, but still it's quite a surprising high cost. Equipment comes next, and then marketing and communications. We found that, and remember the ones that we surveyed and looked at here, they are regional, national or international. They mostly run on 2 to 5 FTE, so still not very high cost infrastructures, but half of those do depend on volunteers, and of those, 2/3 have a medium to high reliance on volunteers. So we see that many of these are at home in academic institutions, and you see that there's a lot of in-kind contribution and volunteer efforts to uphold these infrastructures. We asked them also what are the main sources of income. As you see here, you've got the in-kind contributions, but also national government grants are absolutely critical. And membership fees are also important to sustain operations of this infrastructure. We also asked them what are the most important sources of income. So they of course overlapped with the main sources, but not only. We also saw the European Commission. They were number 2 on the list. I think I can show you here. So you've got national government grants above all, most important, but European Commission grants. And I think this is an interesting one, because if you're thinking about funding the operations of some of these infrastructures, that's not really where the European Commission normally comes in. They come in to develop infrastructure. So I think there is a great dependence on grants to uphold open science infrastructure, which is a bit concerning. We asked the question also, without grants, how long would you remain viable? So fortunately, the majority said more than a year. I know the numbers are small, but again, these are bigger infrastructures and well-known ones. But we still see a number less than a year could survive without grants. So that's really concerning. That's why we need to come in and support. And here we also asked about the financial health, and looking at, again, the operational deficit is covered by grants or sponsored projects. So how do we create this interconnected and thriving ecosystem and sustain it? If we don't take that concerted action, we're going to lose touch with our researchers and the open science community if those are adopted or included by some of the larger commercial platforms in their service portfolios. We'll also lose control over our infrastructures, over the ones that we've helped create, and that's also, of course, a huge waste. And we need to have flexibility and access to these infrastructures. We've seen that in the times of COVID. We don't want our services compromised. We've seen how we're dependent on many of them. So going forward, what can we do as owners and leaders of open science infrastructure, and also as funders, as libraries? So I think it's really important that we promote good governance and that we ourselves engage in that governance. So if we have our own infrastructures, promote and ensure that you have a good governance in place, but also engage with other services that you perhaps pay for to serve the interests of the research community. We also really need to promote more open standards, open source and open principles. Also, when you are paying your membership fees, ask that from your services and infrastructures. Where are they on that horizon? Can they do more? Think about supporting not just the development of certain services, but also the operations. The funders like the European Commission are often looking after development, but we need to look after operations. So our institutions through in-kind contributions, but also through membership fees or donations, and experiment with new funding mechanisms. So like with SCOS, and I think you've already had a presentation on SCOS. So these services really still need your support going forward to fund their operations. But I'd like to end on another really important point. We need to help build capacity as a community in this area. So much has grown over the last years. We need to collaborate and share expertise and upskill to innovate and to save costs. So on the areas that I've talked about, on good governance, on open content and standards, and also on financial sustainability, on the business models or on the financial models that work. We need to showcase good practices. Here, I don't know whether you know about the IOI interviews that we did also as part of this project. We interviewed a range of non-profit and for-profit infrastructures, asking them about their sustainability journeys and what they chose. What are the drivers for those infrastructures? Sorry, that was a little bit quick. So if you look at the range of infrastructures we have here, from Archive and Redalyc to things like Mendeley or Code Ocean or EDP Sciences with their China connection. So there's some really nice stories to be read there. And the sustainability journeys that they chose very much had to do with their mission and their vision. So what their purpose was. Also whether they were working for the common good, like with Redalyc, for example, in Latin America, or whether it was more for competition and to make profits. And of course, the governance structure and the legal structure will either facilitate or impinge upon what you can do and how you can raise funds. Yeah, if you're a not-for-profit, you may not be able to get funds from specific resources going forward. And of course, it's also important who you partner with, and that influences how you sustain yourselves. And how do you also develop or source your competencies? So the competencies that often smaller startups don't have, like budgeting and accounting skills or contracts, procurement, HR, technology. Do you develop this all in-house, or do you actually outsource it or build capacity together? So helping build capacity together, what's important is that we really join up more that infrastructure and build partnerships. So with, for example, Invest in Open Infrastructure, with operas who you know well, with Fair is Fair, so groups promoting more fair practice across a range of infrastructures, for example, or also to work with or to attend events like JROS that brings lots of infrastructures together to share and build competence. So I think we need to build more communities of practice where we really share more and discuss and address some of these challenges that go beyond projects. So I think Pierre is going to talk more about this. He's been leading the OA Diamond study, and we have been thrilled to be part of this really important study. I know you might have many questions, but we won't be able to address those today. But the OA Diamond study really showed also how important infrastructure is to connect those thousands of journals. If you haven't already seen the findings or the recommendations, above all the recommendations, we've seen many people have found the findings, but not necessarily the recommendations. They're really key for going forward. But here, building capacity is absolutely essential, and so is a shared and common infrastructure. So for an open and diverse infrastructure that's more community-led, connected and sustainable, those are some of the things that we need to address. I'm really happy to answer any questions. And I'd like to also thank you very much, COUPERIN members, for contributing membership fees, because that really helps support the work that we do at SPARC Europe. Thank you.
What kind of new services beyond open access to publication research data seems to be provided by to researcher by OSI, which I guess is Open Science Infrastructure? Just open your mic.
Right, sorry. Yeah, you know, using these acronyms, it's probably not a very good idea. So OSI, that was just a short acronym for Open Science Infrastructures, you know, the whole group of infrastructures. So it's not a particular organization or anything. I think let me just go back to a slide, to that one. So if you want to know about the newer infrastructures, we didn't look at the very new ones and at projects. Remember, projects were excluded and the very new ones were also excluded. We wanted to look at infrastructures that are being used by our researchers and have been used over the years, right? So things that are reasonably mature. So if you want to know what are the hot new areas, this study won't tell you that, and I think I won't even go there because there are lots of areas. But the importance of identifiers are really key here, and providing more seamless access to information. And indexing, of course, is also key.
Okay,
so,
and just another question.
Yes.
Is, which European Commission grants are used to fund those open science, that's OSI? Which European Commission grants are used to fund the open science infrastructure?
Right, that's a good question. So we actually, I can't answer that specifically. So you saw the importance of the EC grants, which ones specifically. So we now have the New Horizon program, so that going forward is your go-to really in the coming years. But there are other grants, and we actually have about 100 different. So we did ask the infrastructures who were the funders, and we have the names of about 100, and we have categorized those. I haven't got a slide on that actually, and I need to dig that out. So if that person would like to have a bit more information on that, please, you know, reach out to me. Hold on, go to my.
I'll put your email in the chat if needed.
Oh, good, well done. There we are. Yes.
Okay.
So yeah, so there is a range, but you know, if you're really thinking about infrastructure, you see that national governments are really key in funding these infrastructures. Yeah.